Hey guys, grace and peace to you all today. Welcome to the Shield Online, our weekly wander through the stories of Scripture. I am Captain Roger McCord of the Hanford, California Corps of the Salvation Army. You may notice I'm dressed a little differently today. I've got some stuff going on this weekend, and we are trying to do this recording kind of on the fly. And I apologize both for the sound quality and the video, but hopefully it will be better than if I just tried to capture it from across a room, which is my other alternative. So, let's get right into it. Last week we told a story about Jesus leading his followers into the Phoenician side of Syria and demonstrating that acceptance was more important than following human boundaries and rituals. Now, it must have been a hard lesson for those guys, or just one that they didn't all agree on, because Jesus immediately took them southeast, through Israel, across the Sea of Galilee, and into the province known as Decapolis. Like Phoenicia, this was Gentile territory, and just being here was enough to unsettle them. This was enemy territory. Every step, every interaction ran the risk of infecting them. Even if they were perfectly ritually pure when they arrived, they could find themselves coated in spiritual defilement through contact with unclean people, unclean things, or just the unclean area itself. I mean, it's fine to think about foreigners as people, but that doesn't mean you want to interact with them, right? That was kind of the attitude a lot of the people here had. But Jesus was here dragging his crew out of Israel again. Now, some folks think maybe he was just trying to get away from the crowds for a little while. Very few people followed him out of Israel. His key disciples and a handful of others were with him. That's about it. Perhaps that meant there would be a little peace from that endless stream of people asking about healing. Maybe here in the Decapolis they wouldn't get swarmed like they did in Israel. Well, that hope died as soon as they got near the first town. Folks were already gathered up along the road, waiting, and more could be seen coming in down the hills. And the disciples, I'm sure they were all like, oh, well, maybe the master will turn aside and we could just avoid all that. But of course not. Jesus strode right into the midst of the crowd as if they were as if they were kin, speaking shalom, touching, holding hands, even exchanging a holy kiss here and there with those who leaned forward for it, ignoring any muttering from his own followers while he did so, I might add. Then, kind of a familiar-looking group came to them. I mean, not the individuals, they were Gentiles, probably from one of the cities somewhere nearby, but the way that they moved as a group was the same as Israelites who had come to see Jesus sometimes. It was a cluster of people around another, and that other is someone who obviously had some disability. And that one always kind of had a haunted look to them, as if they knew there was nothing for them here. Even those who saw Jesus heal someone always seemed to think that it just wasn't quite going to work out for them. They just seemed like they expected to be disappointed. Until Jesus spoke to them. And he always seemed to do that. He'd share a few words, and then he would do whatever else, or sometimes nothing else. And the injured person's pensive look would fade as they realized that they could walk, or see, or breathe, or that their skin no longer had those scales or rash on it, that they were really and truly healed. And when that happened, the reaction was almost always the same. Their face would just light up with pure joy. Those who had been blind would spin around, trying to see everything, everywhere, all at once. And those who had been lame would walk a few cautious steps and then break into a little jig as if their excitement just needed to get out through their legs. Lepers would immediately reach out for someone to touch them or for them to touch someone, and who could blame them? These people had all lived with their malady for however long, and now they would live without it. That burden that they carried was gone. Now, the group before them now were obviously not Jews. They were dressed in Greek style. They were wearing brightly colored robes and cloaks held in place by brooches and belts in similar or contrasting colors. Very different from the earth tones favored by most of Israel at that time. And the man that they led to Jesus, he walked well enough. So it wasn't until the disciples saw how he watched the lips of each speaker that they discerned he was deaf, though by then the men with him had begun to explain that to Jesus. Apparently he'd been able to hear and speak when he was younger, but for a long time now no sound made itself known to him. His speech had become this odd mockery of the human voice, broken and wordless in the sounds that it uttered, as if his tongue had turned to stone. "Please, just lay your hand on him," the man's friends begged Jesus. "We've heard you could make him well." Well, instead, the teacher reached out and placed his hand on the man's shoulder, asking him to come apart with him. And they left the man's friends in the crowd a few steps behind, while the disciples used themselves to kind of create a discreet space around Jesus and this man. It wasn't what we would think of as private. Everyone could still see and hear everything, but it did create some intimacy that the crush of bodies had denied them. Now, the disciples had seen the Master heal hundreds of times by now, maybe even thousands. They'd even done it themselves, carefully following the steps that he had given them before he sent them out in pairs to share his message that the kingdom of God was at hand. But what Jesus did was different every time. I mean, almost obsessively so. He didn't use a ritual he had learned or a scroll that would guide him through the steps to bring about healing. Sometimes he spoke, sometimes he prayed. He might lay on hands or smear mud onto an affected area, and at times he just told someone to go do a thing, and by the time they had done it, they found they were restored. And there was this one time, Peter and the sons of thunder, that's James and John, they'd been with Jesus when he simply took the hand of a dead girl into his own and told her, "Get up," and she did. But this time he did something even stranger, something they found more confusing than anything Jesus had done before. This time, he became a faith healer, at least in a way. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, well, of course he was a faith healer. You know that he was. Well, yes, and I have thrown that term around where Jesus is concerned, but it isn't really accurate for any story about healing that Jesus has done other than this one. See, faith healers were not exactly rare. They weren't usually very successful, but they weren't rare. Most peddled their services to those who were willing to pay a price, and then they would gather a crowd if they could and go to work. Often they would begin by touching the affected body part and then spitting, sometimes even spitting at others in the room. It was thought to be a way to ward off the evil eye that a companion could have caused, maybe even by accident. Sometimes they would spit on the injured area, thinking that it could clean and speed the healing, which makes sense in a way, I guess. If you just observe the world, you see that animals, when they have a cut or a bleeding sore, it's not unusual for them to just lap at it incessantly until it's healed. And so the ancients thought, well, that means spit must be the reason that people are getting, or animals are getting better when they're doing that. So why not use that to heal other people? But of course, sensible people do not lick the open sores of other humans, so they would simply spit on them and then rub to spread it over the area instead. After that, there would be spoken words of power, usually in a language unknown to any of the people around, or in a secret language that we might say sounded a lot like made-up gibberish, if we were the skeptical sort. And the healer would say, well, this is the tongue of the spirits, and that he was using it to issue commands so that those spirits would either heal the affliction or they would leave and stop causing that. And faith healing, it always seemed to involve a flair for the dramatic. And the more accomplished the healer was said to be, and the more expensive their services, the larger their flair tended to be, right? And then after all this stuff, there was a finishing gesture or action or command that the healer would give. Sometimes it was as simple as just ordering that injured person to be well. But more often it involved them needing to rest for many days or applying a salve of some kind, again, for some number of days. Those who helped the ill were usually warned that if they did not do so exactly as prescribed, that affliction might continue or resume, possibly even get worse. It was sometimes noted that healers were often long gone before any result could be seen, positive or negative. And then if the person recovered in part or in whole, the healer would be praised for their amazing work. And if they didn't, it was likely because those involved just hadn't followed the healer's instructions properly, or maybe there was some unresolved evil which either the helper or the disabled hadn't properly addressed. Nothing the healer could control there. No, that's all on you. Now, when we read stories about Jesus healing, and we see that the crowds are amazed, it's usually because he didn't do any of those things that healers were expected to do. And any healing took place in the instant he said, without fail. But this time, in this circumstance, for this person, Jesus did something differently. This time, Jesus treated the man using some of the techniques of a faith healer. Now, it wasn't quite the same. In fact, it was different in some pretty big ways. You just got to picture it here. In their little bubble of pseudo-privacy, Jesus stood in front of the man. He very carefully put the index finger of each hand into the man's ears. And for just a few seconds, he left them there. Then he took them out, and he motioned the man to do what he did. And then Jesus stuck his tongue out, and the man mimicked him. Now, having touched the ears and having seen the tongue, Jesus turned and he spit on the ground 3 times. Again, the traditional symbol among Jews and Greeks for warding off something evil. And he reached up and he touched the man's tongue. Then, where a faith healer might call on their powers or those of their patron, Jesus looked up to heaven. And then we're told he uttered a deep sigh, his breath blowing across the man's face. Now, in the liturgy of a faith healer, this was the healer putting his own life force into the next words that would be spoken, those mystical words in a spirit tongue which would invoke supernatural creatures to come and effect their cure. And Jesus says, Ephaphra, which sounds like an unknown word of power, doesn't it? Except it's just Aramaic, the language that people there used. And instead of being an appeal to spirits or powers, it simply meant open. Now, was that a command? Was it a plea? Was it a statement of fact? I don't know. What I do know is that in the instant that Jesus did that, we're told the man's ears were opened and his tongue was set free, and he could hear and speak just as well as any other person. Jesus used no incantations, no gibberish, and no rituals. It almost seems as if he used the forms of faith healing as a way of showing that he wasn't like those guys. What they used to mystify their audiences, Jesus was using to reassure his. Look, this is what you expect, but I'm not going to use words you don't understand, or long ceremonies you don't know, or complicated instructions that are going to make it your fault if the healing is incomplete. Instead, all Jesus did was set the man free from a malady that had imprisoned him and kept him from interacting with others the way he wanted to. Now, the last thing a faith healer often did was kind of the ancient version of passing out business cards to the crowd. They would make sure that everyone knew their name and where to reach them, and that they had very reasonable rates for those who paid in advance and understood that there were no guarantees. But Jesus told the people around him not to tell anyone. And that's not quite as secretive as it sounds, because it's not about keeping what happened hidden. He's not saying to the man who was healed, oh, go pretend you're not healed, pretend you're still deaf or you can't talk. No, he's not saying that at all. And he's not saying to those who witnessed this that they're not allowed to talk about it. This is more of a way to say that this wasn't a big deal. It's God's work being done by God's power. It's not anything to celebrate any human being for. A point, by the way, that the people there missed, as did so many of those who saw the miracles Jesus performed. They were always so flabbergasted by what happened that they couldn't help but tell everyone about it. Did you hear about Jesus? I was right there, right in the front ranks. When he made the deaf hear and the mute speak, I was there, I tell you. And what he did, oh, it was good. It was good. And like ripples in a pond, words spread out and across like a wave. And more people came to see Jesus and decide for themselves who and what he was. Now, Deciding that shouldn't have been hard, not once he'd been out doing what he did for a while. Even though this crowd of Gentiles may not have known it. About 700 years before, there was this man named Isaiah. He'd written down some messages from God to the people who were to follow his way. Messages about the anointed king who was going to come to bring healing to those who pledged their allegiance to him. And these messages suggested that that king would be easily identified because when he came, the eyes of the blind would be opened, the ears of the deaf unstopped, and mute tongues would be made able to shout for joy. And following this king on his path of holiness would lead to being rescued, to celebration, and to the departure of sorrow. Now, people who knew nothing of who or what Jesus might be felt compelled to talk about him. He was amazing to them. A healer who was empowered by the Most High God. They couldn't keep that to themselves. They couldn't keep it quiet. Following Jesus changed people's lives for the better. Some in miraculous ways, and some just by him inviting them to walk his path, to live how he showed them to. Jews or Gentiles, he fed them what they needed. He freed them from the chains binding them and encouraged them to live the way God had created them to, rather than living the way of the world, the way that the world pushed them to. What have you seen Jesus do in your life? How about the lives of people around you? Have you told anyone about that? I mean, these strangers from another country, they couldn't keep quiet about him. People in his own nation couldn't either. Oh, he's done everything well, they said to one another, to those who had been with them and to those who had missed everything. Oh, let me tell you about Jesus and what he's done so you can go and hear and see and learn from him yourself. I mean, that's what I'm saying to you right now, too, isn't it? That's why we gather here each week, right? So we can share about Jesus and the things that he has done for all of us. And then everyone can go check that out and make up their own mind what to do with the things that he's teaching. And then go and talk about Jesus. I'm going to stop right there. But grace and peace to each and every one of you this week. And remember, whoever you are, wherever you are going, whatever circumstance or situation you have found yourself in, you have nothing to fear because God is there. There's nowhere you can go that God isn't already present. Just turn and go with God. I will catch you all next time.